anyone out of hell who was considered to have committed a mortal sin. So you take a vow. Some people you could kind of put off having to pay back a debt if you went on a crusade. Maybe you messed around with a farmer's daughter and wanted to get out of Dodge for a little while. That could be another reason. But that's just kind of like the general overview. And so I don't want to go in too much depth here, but I'll just stop there.
Now, the main character, Balian, he was from France, and most of these crusaders at this time were French knights. They depict in the movie as his village is just a complete dump. I mean, more or less, they're all living in hovels and lean-tos that can barely stand up. What was the economic situation in Western Europe at that time, and why does it seem, is this accurate, but why does it seem like most of the knights who were going on crusades seem to have come from France?
Yeah, that's a good point. So a point on the economy is when we get into the 1100s and the 1200s, we're entering what scholars would call the High Middle Ages. Maybe that's a little later, 1300s, but then that gets into the Renaissance. This is entering an economic boom period for Europe. It's finally overcoming what we call the Dark Ages. Now, it used to be the Dark Ages was between 500 and 1500, and historians don't like that now because it unfairly mischaracterizes the Middle Ages as being full of superstition and ignorance. When we use the Dark Ages now, what they're talking about is a period between 500 to 1000, or maybe even more specifically, 500 to 750, where we simply don't have that much in terms of historical records about the period and we don't know what was going on. But it is true that Europe's economy collapses because you have these constant invasions. You have the barbarian invasions in the 400s. You have Viking invasions in the 800s. Finally, at about 950, 1000, these mass population movements stop. It's possible to rebuild the economic institutions of Europe. It's no longer so terribly dangerous to travel from city to city. Merchants can go from town to town. Pilgrims can go from town to town. Kingdoms are starting to be able to be built up again. Kingdoms that evolve into states are solidifying. So you have economic growth and you have more economic wealth. Now, part of the reason of why it seems like there were so many French knights, and there were, like Godfrey of Bouillon, some of the main leaders of the First Crusade, were typically French. France is one of the most populous and wealthiest places in Europe during the Middle Ages and into the High Middle Ages. The Norman conquest of 1066 was by Norman King, William the Conqueror. And there's quite a close connection between England and France. Many of the great crusaders, even those considered English kings like Richard the Lionheart, couldn't speak English. They spoke French. So they were very French in identity. England was in some ways kind of like an outpost of France at this period. So they projected the wealth. Feudalism, as we understand it, was perhaps at its most sophisticated expression in France. So quite simply, those who had the money to go on a crusade were mostly from France. And it was expensive to go on a crusade. Jonathan Riley Smith, who analyzed many charters and legal documents of crusaders when they would sell off property and goods to fund it, he estimated it'd take the average crusader about 7 years worth of wages. They had to liquidate all sorts of assets because it's not just you on your horse. You'd have your war horse, and you don't travel on that thing because it's uncomfortable. You have your riding horse. You have maybe 2 or 3 remounts. You have your war horse. You have your cook. You'd have a servant. If you're really wealthy, you might have a chronicler. You could bring your family. It was expensive. So that's one of the reasons why you see a lot of French people going out. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
Now we're starting to dig into these reasons why people went into crusades. But as you said in the introduction, the lens that later scholars have used to look at the crusades has sort of changed along the way. One of the first reasons that a lot of scholars say that crusaders went to the Holy Land was as a sort of colonialization where second sons would go to make their way in the world. And that's actually, I think they said that almost verbatim in the movie. is there an accuracy to that? You said that it wasn't really a really highly successful way to make money when you have to basically sell all of your assets to go to the Holy Land. Was there any economic motivation for a lord in, say, central France to go to Jerusalem?
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up. When I said earlier that the Crusades seem to be reinterpreted for every generation, Kingdom of Heaven is a perfect example, because there's one point where Orlando Bloom is giving a speech that when he's trying to rally the troops to defend Jerusalem, he shouts, "This city, it's Jewish temples that Romans built upon, that Christians then built upon for their churches, that Muslims built upon for their mosques. So no religion has a claim to this city." And I think you're a medieval knight and you're going to rally your troops with a speech on 21st century multiculturalism. That's just like this is one of the worst examples I can think of, where an earnest screenwriter thinks, "Oh, people were so intolerant in the past. I wish I could go back and teach them the message of tolerance. I know, I'll project myself through time travel into this protagonist." And so, I mean, I know they meant well, but it's one of like the worst examples of presentism, where you're taking contemporary values in the past. And I know you have to do that to some level, because you have to make a protagonist relatable and likable for a modern audience. With the second son theory, how does that make sense? Where does this come from? And would we actually see this? I'll mention a little bit more about the motivation and talk about this idea. You wouldn't be motivated by greed to go on a crusade. The second son theory is that the first son has the lion's share of property and inheritance when he goes off. And second son theory does make sense in certain contexts. A lot of the travelers in the age of navigation, the age of exploration in Europe in the 1500s, 1600s are second sons who are freebooters. Maybe they'll seek their fortune elsewhere because they won't get their family's estate. The older brother will. But crusading wouldn't be a good way to do that. It's expensive. Many people had to sell their lands, take out loans from moneylenders, Jewish moneylenders, or rely on family support. They're going for the ideas of pilgrimage, which is firmly entrenched in Christian doctrine, and rich and poor go on this. The wealthy just travel in more style. And it's seen as an act of penance, because the hardships and expensive travel were seen as a way that someone could earn absolution from their sins. Now, this idea of the second son theory, I think it goes back to the Enlightenment period around the 1700s or 1800s. This is where you see historians writing about the Crusades. You'll have French universal histories. And the 1800s is where you see a major backlash against the Crusades. Enlightenment writers see the Middle Ages as superstition, the iron-fisted control of the church that destroys the free thought and expression that existed during the Roman Empire. And only in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment are we getting back. And were it not for the Middle Ages, we would be 1,000 years ahead of where we are now. So they'll come with some theories that might be based on one or two individuals and then projected over all the Crusades. You can kind of see you can see a couple of examples of landless sons heading out to carve out territories of their own. For example, Bohemond and Tancred, who are leaders on the First Crusade, who are Normans. These do spring to mind. Bohemond, I think, takes control of Antioch. So you do see a couple of examples like this, but most of the Crusaders didn't go east to settle on land at all. In fact, the ultimate failure of the Crusades, and the Crusader states were referred to as Outremer, or across the sea. The reason it failed was because people didn't settle on the lands. They didn't consolidate it. The overwhelming majority of Crusaders, they serve their time in Outremer and then they go home. The Crusader states were really, from the beginning to the end, they were short on military manpower and collapsed as a result of this. And that's because the quote-unquote landless second, third, and fourth sons was a myth, and they didn't settle in these areas. One of the reasons that the Crusades were able to succeed as long as they could, despite being critically short on manpower, is that the one thing medieval Europe does better than probably anyone anywhere else on Earth, and even China, is fortifications, military fortifications. Europe is just covered with castles and forts, and engineers are brilliant at building fortifications, knowing how to blow up enemy fortifications. And with these fortifications, it's possible to control areas of land with much smaller numbers than you could otherwise. And in Kingdom of Heaven, they show the siege battle with Saladin against Jerusalem. And I think this is where Ridley Scott gets Lord of the Rings envy and tries to have his own Battle of Gondor there. But that is a point that in terms of siege engineering and the battle to take Jerusalem originally in the First Crusade is by some brilliant siege maneuver of these Crusaders. The place where the Crusaders run into trouble is when they're traveling between cities, and Turkish archers who are brilliant on horseback and horseback mounted archers are constantly picking them off. So there's not money to be made as the second son. Where that theory came from, like I said, these Enlightenment scholars who aren't doing a critical analysis of history. They're not going through thousands of documents and trying to rebuild economic models of crusading. They're just looking at some old chronicles in Latin and they're riffing on them, and they're just writing extemporaneously about their thoughts on it and just filling in the blank areas with their own thoughts and impressions. Now, in the 1830s and the 1850s, in the Romantic period, then you get Sir Walter Scott, who's writing about these heroic, noble, chivalrous exploits of the Crusaders, and that's where you get more of the flowery imagery that we see today.
So this movie takes place in about the 1180s. So about 80-ish years later, a couple of generations down the line. What was the context? What was going on in the Crusades and in the Holy Land in this next generation or two after the initial call to crusade?
Yeah, so that is something that I think the movie does get pretty well, and that's all the infighting that's happening during this time period. It's not Christians versus Muslims paints over a lot of the nuance that's taking place. So what's happening in the 1180s is one of the main characters, Saladin, whatever. He is the leader of a new state, the Ayyubid state, that is taking power in Egypt, in Syria, and consolidating a lot of power in the remains of these old empires. Now, one of the reasons that the First Crusade succeeded was due to fighting between the Seljuk Turks and the Fatimids, which are a Shiite group based in Egypt. The Seljuks had controlled Jerusalem. The Fatimids were trying to take it back. As the Crusaders are marching down to Jerusalem, Fatimids are actually sending them embassies. They're giving them food and aid to support the Crusaders to try to take this city. Right before the Crusaders arrive in Jerusalem, the Egyptian Fatimids actually take it back from the Turks, and they send messengers and envoys to the Crusaders saying, guys, you don't have to come. We got the city. We kicked out those Turks. And it's not like they don't completely realize that the Crusaders aren't terribly interested in who controls the city. And I don't think they're terribly interested that it's Muslims. It's if it had been Jews or Buddhists who had controlled the city and harassed pilgrims, they probably would have fought it on equal measure as far as I understand. But because of this infighting, the Fatimids hadn't really been able to consolidate their hold and control over the city. That's what gives the Crusaders a critical advantage. What happens with Saladin is that the infighting amongst different Muslim powers in the Middle East ceases. He's able to consolidate control. He's able to raise up a very large army. And in the movie, you see Orlando Bloom's character, Balian, enter. There is a king, Baldwin IV, who had leprosy, which he did, and he went into combat with leprosy. Very fascinating figure. He's on his deathbed, and there's questions of royal succession. His son, Baldwin V, will take over, or not his son, but his nephew, and then it finds out that he has leprosy. He ends up getting killed, and then another figure becomes king. So I don't want to get into all those details because it gets confusing, but what that does accurately illustrate is the dynastic infighting and the political intrigue that is happening at this time. It's sort of a reverse of what was happening to different Muslim states in the 1090s. And this is a classic feature, of course, of European monarchical politics, of different relatives trying to claim by divine right that they have access to the throne. And this therefore gives them right. Maybe they are killed. Maybe they die of natural causes, and another relative tries to claim the throne in their place. This is, broadly speaking, the context of what's happening prior to the rise of Saladin. And this is after the Second Crusade. The First Crusade is to take Jerusalem. The Second Crusade in the 1120s, 1130s is when a couple of the outlying smaller kingdoms of Edessa fall, and there's attempts to reclaim them because Europeans see these as rightfully held by Christendom. That fails. Then this movie is between the Second and Third Crusade. Jerusalem surrenders to Saladin. He retakes Jerusalem. And the Third Crusade is Richard the Lionheart and these other figures